I've only told this story to a handful of people, and every time the reaction is the same: disbelief. People laugh it off, tell me I'm making it up, that if I'm going to spin some wild story, I should at least make it believable. Even my own mother said that. So after a while, I just stopped talking about it. I kept what happened to me and Apollo to myself. For a long time, I even started to wonder if maybe I had imagined it all. Some kind of stress-induced breakdown, a hallucination, something my mind had created to explain the unexplainable. Because the truth is, what happened shouldn't be possible. But I know I didn't lose my mind. I know what I saw. And I know, because I've heard others tell stories like mine. That's why I'm sharing this one last time. For anyone who has gone through it or might be going through it now, so they'll know it's real, and they're not alone. That evening, I was exhausted when I got home from work. The kind of exhaustion that weighs you down, making even simple things feel like too much effort. I wanted nothing more than to collapse on the couch and do nothing. But Apollo, my loyal canine companion, had other plans. The second I walked through the door, he was bounding toward me, his massive frame thudding against the floorboards. At nearly 90 pounds, he was impossible to ignore. His thick coat, powerful build, and endless energy made him a presence all on his own. He was my best friend. And right now, he wanted his walk. Apollo was already spinning in circles, his deep chest huffing out excited breaths, his big brown eyes locked onto mine like he knew I couldn't say no. I sighed. I was too tired for this, but I couldn't let him down. So I grabbed his leash, clipped it to his harness, and took him to the dog park. Conveniently, the dog park was just a few blocks away from my house. It was early evening, just before dark. The sky was deepening, streaked with the warm, fading hues of sunset golds and burning oranges, slowly giving way to the encroaching twilight. Yet the streetlights hadn't fully flickered on yet. The park was still active, a few dog owners scattered around chatting while their dogs ran free. I let Apollo off the leash. He took off immediately, galloping across the open space with the kind of excitement only a dog could have. His paws hit the dirt hard, his thick tail wagging wildly behind him. As he ran, another dog, a medium-sized, scruffy-looking mutt, joined him. The two of them immediately hit it off, chasing each other across the park, weaving between the trees, wrestling in the grass. I smiled, relieved to see Apollo burning off his energy. That's when I noticed the boy. He was standing near the edge of the park, watching the dogs play. He looked too young to be there alone, maybe 5 or 6 years old, small and skinny, wearing a faded blue hoodie that looked a little too big for him. That is when the scruffy mutt who was playing with Apollo ran over to the boy and just stood there. The boy knelt down. But what struck me most was what he started doing. He was talking, not to another kid, not to an adult, to the dog. I watched from a distance as the boy crouched beside the scruffy mutt, whispering something to it. His lips moved quickly, like he was having an actual conversation. And then, the dog turned its head toward him. And I swear, for just a second it almost looked like the dog was listening. I shook the thought away. It was just a kid talking to his pet. Nothing weird about that. But before I could look away, the boy stood up and walked straight toward me. I wasn't expecting him to speak, but he did. "Is that your dog?" His voice was small, curious. I nodded. "Yeah, his name's Apollo." The boy's face lit up with excitement. "Apollo, that's a cool name." I smiled. "Thanks." Then, he said something that made my stomach drop. "You know your dog talks, right?" I blinked. At first, I thought I must have misheard him. "What?" The boy grinned like he had just shared a secret. "Your dog talks." I stared at him. I wanted to laugh it off, to say, "Yeah, sure, he talks. We have full conversations over dinner." But there was something about the way the kid said it. Something too certain. so I just nodded, humoring him. "Oh yeah? What does he say?" The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to watch Apollo, who had paused again, this time staring straight at me from across the park. The boy's voice was matter-of-fact when he finally spoke. "My dog told me that your dog is just like him." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I forced a chuckle. "And what kind of dog is that?" The boy just smiled. "Why don't you ask him?" Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I watched as the scruffy mutt trotted up beside him, the two of them disappearing into the distance, without a leash. They just walked off together side by side. I sat there, uneasy, watching Apollo. He was still looking at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I couldn't tell what he was thinking. The boy's words wouldn't leave my head. "You know your dog talks, right?" It was stupid, just a kid's imagination. But something about it stuck. The way he had said it, so casual, so certain, like it wasn't even up for debate. And then there was Apollo's reaction. He had been watching me from across the dog park, completely still, his deep brown eyes locked onto me like he was waiting for something. It wasn't the usual quick check-in that dogs do when they want to make sure you're still there. It was longer, more deliberate, like a parent silently studying their child, searching for signs of guilt. The walk home was just as unsettling. Normally, Apollo would tug ahead on the leash, still full of energy even after a long run. But tonight he stayed right beside me, his steps measured and careful. And he kept doing it, turning his head to look at me. Not with excitement, not with curiosity, with something else. It almost felt like he was expecting something from me. Or worse, waiting for me to say something. By the time we got home, I had almost pushed the whole thing out of my mind. I unclipped his leash, let him inside, and locked the door. The house was quiet, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Apollo padded over to his water bowl, lapped up a few noisy gulps, then stood there, just stood there, staring at nothing in particular. And before I even realized what I was doing, I said it. "Can you talk?" It was a joke, just messing around. But the second the words left my mouth, I felt a deep, immediate regret. Apollo's body stiffened. And then, his head turned, slowly, too slowly. The way he looked at me sent a ripple of pure, primal discomfort down my spine. This wasn't a dog reacting to a strange sound. It wasn't the usual tilt of the head when they hear an unfamiliar word. No, this was different. There was something unnatural about it, something wrong. His deep brown eyes locked onto mine, not with confusion, not with recognition, but with something else entirely. And in that moment I realized it didn't feel like a look from a dog. It felt like a look from something else. We stared at each other for what felt like a full minute. Neither of us moved. The house was dead silent. And then, he turned away. No reaction, no bark, nothing. Just turned his back on me and walked out of the room. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Apollo never acted like this. He was always hyper, always affectionate, always aware of me. But now he acted like I wasn't even there, like I was no longer important. I forced a laugh, trying to shake the unease creeping into my chest. "All right, buddy. Good talk." He didn't move, didn't even lift his head. Just laid there, staring at the wall. I went to bed that night feeling off. I told myself it was nothing, just a mix of exhaustion and that weird conversation at the park. But deep down, something felt different, and I could feel it in the air, like something had shifted. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. For a moment, I wasn't sure why. The house was silent, too silent. No distant hum from the fridge, no creaking beams, just an empty, waiting stillness. Then, something fell in the kitchen, a sharp, distinct clatter. I jolted upright, every nerve in my body going rigid. What the hell was that? I turned my head toward the bedroom door. It was open, just enough to let in a sliver of darkness from the hallway. I listened, holding my breath, but the house was still quiet now. For a split second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a dream, one of those half-asleep, half-awake sounds that don't actually exist. Then I glanced at Apollo's dog bed, and my stomach dropped. It was empty. That was weird. Apollo never slept anywhere else. Even if he got up in the middle of the night for water, he'd always come back. But now, he wasn't there. I slid my feet over the side of the bed, stepping onto the cool hardwood floor. My pulse thudded in my ears as I moved toward the hallway, my muscles tense, my breathing shallow. "Apollo?" I whispered. No sound, no movement, just the heavy press of silence against my ears. I stepped into the hallway, the shadows stretched and distorted in the dim glow from the streetlights outside. The air felt electrified, not cold, not warm, just tingling, like I was moving through something I couldn't see. I turned the corner into the kitchen. Everything was in its place. No open cabinets, no broken plates, nothing knocked over, no sign that anything had fallen, and no sign of Apollo. A slow, twisting feeling crept up my spine. I swallowed hard. Apollo? I heard it before I saw him. The faint click of nails on wood. Then, Apollo emerged from the empty spare bedroom down the hall. He walked toward me at a calm, unhurried pace, his deep brown eyes locked onto mine. And then, he stopped, just a few feet away, not coming closer, not wagging his tail, just standing there. And for the first time since I'd had him, I felt something I never thought I'd feel toward my own dog. Unease. Apollo? He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge me in any way. Just stood there watching, like he was waiting for something. And in that moment, standing there in the dim light of my house, I had the horrible realization that something felt amiss. It wasn't just his silence. It was the way he was looking at me. The same way he had at the dog park. The same way he had on the walk home. Like he was waiting for me to realize something. Like he already knew something I didn't. I swallowed hard. "Come on, buddy. Let's go back to bed." Still, he didn't move. I took a slow step forward. His ears flicked slightly. Not in fear, not in aggression, but in recognition. And then, finally, he turned. Just like that, without a sound, and walked back to his bed, like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep much after that. I lay awake in the dark, listening, waiting, but the house stayed silent, and Apollo never moved again that night. The next morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The night had been too quiet, and Apollo's behavior had left me with a lingering unease I couldn't shake. But when I got up, everything seemed normal. Apollo was curled up in his dog bed, his tail thumping lightly against the floor when he saw me, back to his usual self. For a moment, I almost believed I had just overreacted. That the weirdness at the dog park, the way he had stared at me, the midnight standoff in the hallway, maybe it was all in my head. So I shook it off, scratched behind his ears like usual, and went about my morning routine. The day dragged on uneventfully. Work was the same old grind, but I couldn't stop thinking about last night. Not in an active, consuming way, just a nagging feeling sitting at the back of my mind, refusing to leave. Every now and then, my thoughts would drift back to the boy's words. "You know your dog talks, right?" I had laughed it off at the time. But now I wasn't so sure. By the time I pulled into the driveway that evening, I was ready to let it go. To walk inside, be greeted by Apollo's usual thunderous excitement, take him to the dog park again, and pretend nothing had ever felt off. Except, when I opened the door, Apollo wasn't there. Normally, the second I stepped inside, he'd be jumping all over me, his tail wagging like crazy, letting out excited little grumbles as he demanded attention. But tonight, nothing. The house was still. And for a reason I couldn't quite explain, that silence unnerved me. "Apollo?" No response. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. The air felt heavy. I moved through the house, checking the usual spots: the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. Nothing. Then I reached the empty spare bedroom. And there he was. Apollo was standing in the center of the room, facing the far wall. Perfectly still. He wasn't sniffing at anything. He wasn't pacing or investigating. Just standing there, his head slightly lowered, his ears twitching at the sound of my footsteps. A slow, sinking feeling curled in my gut. Something about the way he stood there, so unmoving, so aware of me, made my skin crawl. Apollo? No reaction. Just the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. Then, he turned. That same slow, unnatural movement as the night before. His head pivoting first, then his body followed, his deep brown eyes locking onto mine. But this time, I saw it. Something else looking back at me. Something that had always been there. And I suddenly had the overwhelming sense that I had done something very, very wrong. I had asked the question, and ever since then, Apollo had been pretending less and less. A deep, sickening thought burrowed into my brain. What if Apollo wasn't really a dog? What if he was something else, wearing a shape of a dog that wasn't quite right? And what if, by acknowledging it, I had given it permission to stop pretending? I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Because now I saw it. I saw the awareness in his eyes, the unnatural intelligence, like he was studying me, waiting to see if I would finally understand. If I would finally realize what I had been living with all these years. I staggered backward, gripping the doorframe like I might collapse. Apollo didn't react, didn't twitch, didn't move at all. He just watched me, and for the first time in my life, I realized I was afraid of my own dog. I didn't eat that night. I didn't take Apollo to the dog park. I barely moved from my chair in the living room, my eyes flicking toward the hallway every few minutes, toward the empty spare bedroom where Apollo was still standing. He hadn't come out, not once. And the worst part? He wasn't sleeping. Normally, Apollo would curl up in his dog bed after dinner, sigh contentedly, and be snoring within minutes. But now he was awake, completely still. I could hear him breathing, slow, steady. But he never left the room, never paced, never checked in on me. He just stood there, like a shadow of something that used to belong in my house, like he was waiting. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the way Apollo had turned his head, too slow, too precise, too aware. Every time I dozed off, I saw his eyes staring through me, filled with something I could no longer pretend was normal. Sometime around 2 a.m., I must have finally drifted off, because the next thing I heard was the front door opening. The sound ripped me out of sleep. I sat up fast, my pulse hammering in my ears. The house was dark, only faint moonlight spilling through the blinds. I listened. Footsteps. Slow, heavy. moving through the house. My breath caught in my throat. Was there somebody inside my house? I reached under my bed, my fingers wrapping around the hilt of the sword I kept there. Some people have baseball bats for protection. I had this. A real one. Heavy. Sharp. Got it from an estate sale years ago. I gripped it tight and stepped out into the hallway. The air felt electrified, like it had the night before. Not cold, not warm, just prickly. Like whatever was in my house was pressing down on everything around it. I moved toward the front door, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around, to leave, to run. But I had to see. I had to know. I turned the corner and stopped cold. The door was wide open, but there was nobody there. I stood frozen, the night air drifting in, making the curtains sway slightly. The world outside was silent. No cars, no insects, no wind. Like everything had been turned off. I swallowed hard and whispered, "Apollo?" No answer. Then, footsteps. Not from outside, from behind me. I spun around, sword raised, and something rushed past me. Something big, something that looked human but couldn't have been. It moved too fast for its size, a dark, towering shape that passed within inches of me, but I couldn't see details, just a massive shadow, shifting, wrong. A blur of something impossibly large slipping right past me toward the open door. By the time my brain processed what had happened, it was already outside. I lunged for the door, slamming it shut, locking it as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I turned back toward the house. Apollo? Silence. I searched every room, the kitchen, the hall, the empty spare bedroom. But there was no sign of him. Apollo was gone. For a long time, I just stood there, gripping the sword in my trembling hands. I didn't chase after whatever it was. I couldn't. Because some part of me knew. That was Apollo. Something I was fooled into believing was a dog I named Apollo. I locked the door. Deadbolt. Chain. Even the sliding latch I never used. I pressed my palm against the wood as if that alone would keep something out. My breathing was uneven, my heart hammering against my ribs. Apollo was gone. But how was any of this possible? Something that had moved like a blur of living shadow as it passed me. Something that should have never been in my house to begin with. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening to the silence pressing against the walls. No footsteps, no wind, no sound of anything outside. Like the world had stopped existing beyond this house. Finally, I turned away from the door. My body was trembling, my fingers still gripping the sword like I was expecting something. But nothing happened. I forced myself to take a breath, then another. Then I walked away from the door. I checked the house again. Every room, every corner. But Apollo was nowhere. It was like he had never even been here. No sign of him. Nothing except that awful, suffocating stillness. I tried to convince myself I was safe. That whatever had left was gone. That I could just sleep and deal with it in the morning. But then, I heard it. At first, it was barely there. A faint rattle, the soft, deliberate shift of the door handle. Testing. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. Someone was trying the door, not knocking, not calling out, just checking. Calm. Patient. Like they already knew I was inside. Like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. The handle jiggled again. Harder this time. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the sword's hilt until my knuckles ached. Don't move. Don't breathe. Then, the handle went still. Silence swelled around me, pressing in from all sides. A silence so thick, so unnatural. I could feel it, standing on the other side of the door. Listening. Waiting. and just as my pulse began to slow, the handle turned, slowly, deliberately, like something was about to let itself in. Then I heard it, the voice. Travis. My stomach turned to ice. It knew my name. The voice was deep, rasping, wrong. Not human, but something pretending to be human. Something that wasn't quite getting it right. A sick mimicry, its words stretching in strange, uneven tones, like it was wearing the shape of language but didn't belong to it. I took a step back. No. The thing outside laughed. Not a bark, not a growl, a real, horrible, wheezing laugh. And the kicking began. Bang! The entire door frame shuddered. I stumbled backward, gripping the sword like it would actually do something. Another thud, then another. It wasn't trying to knock anymore. It was trying to break in. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Who are you? What do you want from me? If you don't leave, I'm calling the police." Silence. Then, that awful laughter again. Travis. My body went rigid. The thing outside dragged in a slow, rattling breath. Then, in that same warped, almost playful tone, "You wanted to know if I could talk." My skin went cold. The answer is yes. I took another step back, but it wasn't finished. And not just that. The voice twisted into something almost mocking. "I can do so much more. I can do so many things." The last bang against the door rattled the whole house. Then, I heard footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Walking away from the front porch. And that same horrible, rasping laughter trailing off into the night. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. I just stood there, staring at the door, knowing this wasn't over. Not even close. Nothing else happened that night. I sat there, sword in my lap, staring into the dark hallway until the first light of morning crept through the windows. But whatever had been there was gone. Or at least it wasn't showing itself anymore. Weeks passed. I told myself I was moving on. I knew I hadn't imagined what happened. I knew deep in my soul and mind how real it all was. I was driving myself to the edge of exhaustion, trying to wrap my mind around the sequence of events, trying to make sense of it all. But then, the noises started. At first, it was small things. A soft shuffle on the hardwood floor when I was lying in bed. The faint sound of breathing nearby when I was alone. A feeling of something standing just out of sight. I tried to ignore it. Told myself it was just nerves, just paranoia, just the absence of Apollo making my mind fill in the gaps. But then, one night, as I sat in the quiet of my house, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Soft nails clicking against the floor. The sound of a big dog moving through the house. I froze. The air felt wrong, just like that night. I waited, barely breathing, listening. And then, a low huff. The quiet, familiar exhale of a large dog settling down somewhere nearby. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body coiled tight. I walked to the hallway. The room was empty, but I could still feel it. Something was here. Something was watching. It didn't happen every night, but often enough that I started to expect it. Some nights I'd be getting ready for bed and hear footsteps trailing behind me. Other times I'd come home from work, step through the door, and hear the faint scuff of claws on wood, just like Apollo used to do when he got excited to see me. But when I'd turn around, when I'd check every corner of the house, there was never anything there. I stopped talking about it. I told myself it wanted my attention, and the more I gave it my attention and energy, the more it would torment me. As for Apollo, I never saw him again. Not once. I ended up putting my house up for sale and moving out of state. There was no way I could feel secure and safe in that house ever again. Besides the fact that whatever that thing was that I called Apollo could try to make his way back inside the house the moment I dropped my guard. But late at night, in the quiet moments, when my new house is quiet and still, I sometimes wonder, what was Apollo really? A shapeshifter? A skinwalker? Something even older? Something that had no name? I didn't know. And the worst part? I started wondering, what if it's not just dogs that are pretending?